maybe some of you guys, if you're not from here, remember that first time you drive 36 and that little overview. I remember pulling over, looking down in the boulder and saying, I've got to live here someday. And so when I was looking at grad schools, I moved out to Colorado. I didn't have anything going on. I was doing some field work and actually ended up doing my graduate work at the University of Colorado, Denver. And have stayed. I love it here. 2 years ago, which is hard to believe, that means I really am getting older, I left a full-time teaching position at the Community College of Aurora to run a travel business. We focus on conservation-based tourism. So in addition to doing things here locally, I get to travel all over the world and study plants and animals and all sorts of fun stuff. So it's a pretty good gig when I can get it. And I teach at the Denver Botanic Gardens quite regularly. I've got a series of classes that start there next week. And so what you're going to hear tonight is kind of a combination of 2 classes that I teach. I've developed for the Denver Botanic Gardens. One is Colorado Ecosystems, and much of the material, if you haven't heard of it, I should have brought it in. My house is on the market. It's actually under inspection today. We're keeping our fingers crossed that we hear good news tomorrow. But there's a great book if you haven't heard of it. It's called From Grassland to Glacier. Ah, perfect. Okay, this is an older version, and it's no longer in print, but I've never had anybody have a problem finding a used copy online. Okay, and so it's by Emmerich and Udall. So From Grassland to Glacier. Emmerich, I believe, is the one. He's also done a more recent one of Rocky Mountain National Park, which covers a lot of the same stuff as well. So this is a good book to have. It's very readable. So I pull a lot from that in my ecosystems class. The other thing is I do a very basic ecology for gardeners, so we'll talk about that. So that's where the 2 classes come from, and then I'm obviously going to relate it specifically to Chatfield this evening, and hopefully keep you guys engaged. One of the things I really do appreciate, if I can get it, is for interaction. There's nothing worse than sitting at the end of your day. How many of you guys ate dinner? I know everybody's snacking, so a few of you ate dinner. The other of you are like, oh my gosh, I wish I would have eaten dinner before I came. I'm starving right now. I hope nobody hears my stomach grumble. Please ask questions. I don't know exactly how long this is going to take because I've never done this presentation where I've taken 3 different components. So you'll see a break. You've got all of the slides in your handout. We'll see where we get, okay, as far as we get. If we get all the way through it, great. If we don't, that's fine too. We're going to get through the important stuff, I think. So let me turn this on. Let's see if it actually will work. I bet it's going to sync. It's not going to sync. So I may have to stand over here.
I can always do it.
Okay, that's fine. We'll go to the next slide. So one of the things, how many of you guys have heard the word ecology before? 100%, right? How many of you guys, without looking at your notes, can give me a full-fledged definition of ecology? Exactly. Few of you, right? So one of the things that I wish I had learned very early on in my education was to dissect words into component word parts, because it makes it a lot easier. I bet most of you could give me the meaning of the suffix logy. Always means the same thing in a word. What does it mean?
And study
of, right? We've all seen that. It's the eco component that becomes a little more difficult. If somebody was going to give me just kind of what you think ecology relates to, what things come to mind first?
Interconnectedness.
Fear, interconnectedness, okay? Anything else? Habitats, okay? We think of the eco movement, right? I mean, eco is used a lot now. Eco drive, if you're in a gas-efficient vehicle, all those things. The word root eco actually means house, okay? So the origin of that word means house. So then logi means study of, so if we put that word back together, the most basic definition of ecology is the study of a house. Well, in reality, that house is habitat or environment. So you're absolutely right in the sense of the environment. So ecology is taking organisms, looking at organisms and trying to figure out how they fit into that system, that house. Okay, so the technical definition is the study of organisms and how they interact with their environment. Environment means the same thing as habitat. It also means the same thing as ecosystem. Those 3 words can be used interchangeably. So ecosystem is a more technical term often, but they really all 3 mean the same thing. Oh, I wish that would work. Thank you. So there's our technical definition, the study of interactions between an organism and its environment. if you're talking about ecological processes or these ideas with anybody that comes out, any of these student groups, I love asking that question. I mean, I'll talk to ecology students and they haven't ever really thought about the word root eco. They know the meaning of the word, but focus on that house. One of the things I'm going to try to tie into this entire discussion this evening is the interconnectedness of all of the things that you're looking at here. Because if you try to touch on multiple facets of that, you're much more likely to get a group engaged if you talk about different things within that. We all have our kind of our preference, but if you can talk about different parts of it, kid A may be interested in rocks. I saw that a lot of geology. Geology to me is like the most boring subject ever. I mean, and I feel bad about it, but my eyes immediately glaze over. I just cannot get into rocks at all. But somebody may really be into rocks, and then another kid's going to be just like me and is like, no, I want to talk about birds. Somebody else may have a fear of birds. I've met quite a few people, I don't know why, that are deathly afraid of birds. They may like plants, you know, whatever. So it's the study of interactions between an organism and its environment. So the environment is where things get kind of more complex. It's that interconnectedness. The environment consists of both abiotic and biotic factors. Well, we can look at the middle or the word root of both of those terms, and we've got bio. Well, what's biology?
Study of life.
The study of life, right? So what does bio mean?
Life.
Life. So what does abiotic mean? Non-living. Tick means pertaining to, a, without. So the word abiotic means pertaining to, without life. What does biotic mean then? With life. Okay? So we're talking about the living and non-living components. How would rocks fit into the environment? They're abiotic. Okay? That's probably why I'm not that interested in them. I like things to move. Okay? I developed an admiration for plants much later on. They didn't come easily. What are some other abiotic factors in the environment? Well, weather's a big, you're right. But weather is actually a combination of factors. If we're going to be talking about tomorrow's weather, what are some things that the news forecasters are going to talk about? Humidity, wind, temperature, air pressure, all of those things which kind of come together for weather. So you actually could divide that term further down. Rock, soil pH would be an example of abiotic factors. What would be some living components in the environment? Bugs, plants, other animals. Does anybody kind of really geek out about a certain subset of living that you want to admit to, that you just can't wait to share with people your passion for?
I like insects.
Insects, there you go. You know that there's a huge demand for entomologists out there right now. All the old school entomologists are retiring and nobody's going into that field. You're guaranteed a job if you go into entomology. I used to try to get my students to get into that all the time. Bugs kind of freak me out a little bit. Okay, but anyway, so environment, it really is the same thing as habitat and ecosystem. Now when we start though, and we start looking at the environment, and this is one of the things that we're going to try to touch on this evening, and as you walk around Chatfield or any of the other places that you go for hikes or drives or whatever, the thing that many of us forget is that plants really are the true indicators. It's all dependent upon the plants. Okay? It all comes down to that. And that's where, and I can't remember the numbers. I was in a talk years ago that asked the question, how many undergrads that go into a biology track at U.S. colleges designate botany as a major their first year? What do you think it is?
3%.
Yeah, it's less than 5%. I mean, it's ridiculously low. I mean, people do not think they're not really that engaged by plants. And I used to have, it was like pulling teeth to get, my students at the college engaged in plants. I could only do it when I started relating it to Colorado plants. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, I have seen that out on hikes or whatever. But we look at plants as indicators of the environment. They're going to be the things that you see in most abundance. They don't get up and leave. That makes it easy to find them throughout the year. And they're going to dictate what comes. Okay? As a gardener, I say if you plant it, they will come, sort of a thing. If you're trying to bring wildlife into your landscape as a gardener, you need to plant the right plants for them to come. Otherwise, they won't. That same thing is going on out in the natural environment. Okay. So we've already answered this question. Abiotic factors would be things like, what again? Rocks in the soil. Soil is technically alive. because soil is a combination of rocks and minerals and soil particles, as well as microbial activity, the bacteria, the fungi, all sorts of things. I took a soil science class, and I always tell the story at the Botanic Gardens. Our lab manual was named "Dirt is a 4-letter word." We were not allowed to use the word dirt. We had to talk about soil, because soil is a much bigger component. But the rock, or the geological components of it would be abiotic, pH, temperature. Slope aspect is a huge factor here in Colorado because of the topographical relief we have with the Rocky Mountains. Humidity, as well as precipitation, annual precipitation. You know, one of the things that's really interesting is this has been a very dry year so far, right? Coming into it. And we just got some decent precipitation, or at least I did at my house yesterday and the day before. What's also interesting, what's really key to the ecology of Colorado, is that much of the annual precipitation actually comes outside of the growing season for plants. That places tremendous pressure on plants, okay? So when you think about the plants that we see that have leaves right now, what do they all have in common?
Conifers.
They're all conifers, right? They're evergreens, and that's important. It's a strategy, and our dominant plants, our dominant trees in the state of Colorado are evergreen because it allows them to tap into that water source in the winter when we get it. The other plants have to. I mean, if we're walking right along Chatfield, do any of these plants have leaves right now? No, and we're going to talk about that as it relates to a riparian environment, which has a lot more water throughout the year. Okay, so biotic factors, the plants, the animals, fungi, the bacteria, which are going to be far more numerous than the others, all sorts of things. Okay, so climate. Okay, climate is a product of weather that you mentioned. Okay, so we have temperature, moisture, precipitation, and winds. So when you think of Colorado, and you think of Colorado's climate, what comes to mind first? Dry. And windy.
Variable.
Cold. Variable, right? Extremely variable. I lived in a lot of places before I lived in Colorado, and everywhere I lived, I heard that saying, if you don't like the weather, wait 30 minutes, it'll change. I promise you it did not hold true until I moved to Colorado. And here we see it in the sense of we can go from an afternoon where it's 60 degrees and a cold front blows in and we start smelling greeley and all those wonderful smells up in the northeast part of the state, and the temperature drops 30, 40 degrees in a matter of an hour or two. The reason we have that is because in Colorado we don't have any large bodies of water. If we were on the coast, right up along the ocean, we wouldn't see those dramatic drops in temperature. Water has a huge effect on stabilizing temperature. Okay? Chatfield Reservoir is not a large body of water. That's why it's frozen right now, right, on the top. And so that has a big effect. And then the fact that we can drive 30 miles west of Denver and gain 9,000 feet in elevation is pretty impressive as well. Okay? And one of the reasons why the Chatfield Basin, and one of the things I noticed, and I'll pull in some of the tidbits, does everybody have a copy of that Explore the Chatfield Basin brochure that's back there? You guys get that as part of your, everybody should have a copy. That should absolutely be in your notebook because it talks about why the Chatfield Basin is so interesting. It is probably the most diverse area of the state that we're sitting in here in Colorado. And much of that has to do with the fact that we've got these different environments from the north, the south, the east, and the west coming together here, and the mountains pick up very quickly. Okay? So that's what makes it so interesting to be out here, actually. Okay, so it's cold, it's dry, it's windy. Anything else? That's it? Okay. Snowy. We wish it would be snowier. Well, I actually really don't like it to snow. I love when I hear it snowing up in the mountains because I know it's going to affect my watershed and my water later on in the summer. All right. Okay. So, this is not a topic I typically talk about, but it's one that we asked about. So, watershed. How many of you guys knew beforehand what a watershed was? You've known that for a long time. A few of you. I have to admit it's not a topic that I ever really taught. And I didn't really focus on it until a few years ago. I was asked by a friend of mine to start doing some trips for her 8th grade students on a study abroad domestically where we actually talked about watersheds in Colorado and then took them. So I took them to San Francisco a couple of years and I took them to New Orleans another year, right after the last big oil spill in the Gulf. And so a watershed, when you think about it, and I don't know why I never really thought about it, especially here in Colorado, we said it was dry, said it was cold. Water is crucial. It really is it's the limiting factor to where plants grow. And if it's the limiting factor as to where plants grow, what does that also mean it limits? People, animals, okay? Here's a little, and I'll come back to this, when we talk about riparian ecosystems or ecosystems near water, the state of Colorado, only about 4% of the state is considered riparian. Yet 95% of the animals in the state of Colorado depend upon riparian ecosystems. Huh? And then
at some point in their life.
At some point, yeah. Yeah, obviously it's right. But that's still a huge, factoid or whatever to think about water. And the nice thing about this area here is you have a lot of water. Okay? I mean, you're in a riparian environment in addition to having the reservoir. So the definition of a watershed, for those of you guys that were like me, is an area of land where all of the water that's underneath it drains off of it, goes into the same place. So when we're talking, and obviously because water, so that's the other thing too, water is actually way more important than food. Okay? Even to us, we can go a lot longer without food than we can go without water. Okay? It's just, everything is tied to it. Some organisms more than others. But so organisms living in that watershed are going to be linked to one another. So no matter what you are, what you do, or where you are in that watershed, what you do affects it. It's kind of like, I mean, how many of you guys have ever noticed those signs that you see? I always think of it, I used to, when I was at Auraria, I think maybe it was the first time I really noticed it, but the little drain signs that says don't pour, I don't know, what did the signs say? It's something about don't pour something down here because, it affects your watershed or goes in the rivers. I mean, eventually the water from the Colorado River here in the state of Colorado on the eastern slope goes where? The Mississippi, and then eventually into the Gulf of Mexico, right? It's kind of hard to imagine that if we were to dump something in the water here, it could end up in the Gulf of Mexico. If we go on the western slope, where's it going to go? Yeah, the Pacific Ocean. Okay. Now, when we talk about the watershed here, I think go ahead and go to the next slide. Okay. We talk about Chatfield watershed. Okay, I did give you a map. I think is it a separate handout or is it in there? Okay, I wasn't able to kind of pull it into the slide. If you look at it, well, the area that's covered in the Chatfield watershed is much bigger than I would have ever thought it was. What about you guys? I mean, look at all it contains. Okay. Now the river that's going to feed into this is what river? What's the river that's going to feed into Chatfield Reservoir eventually? The Platte. Which part of the Platte? The South Platte. Okay. Where does that South Platte start? Look, you can go ahead and go to the next one. Up in Nebraska, that's actually the North Platte.
Okay.
And so they come together there. And that area is really, we were talking earlier, I'm headed up there next month for the big sandhill crane migration. It's a huge congregation of not only sandhill cranes, but waterfowl because of this dependency of water, and they kind of use that in their migratory path. Okay, it forms in this in Park County. Okay, so southwest of Denver, about 15 miles southeast of Fairplay. So that's where it originates. Comes through the state, gets to Littleton, their closest town, and then it impounds to form the Chatfield Reservoir. And Chatfield, we could also kind of look at Cherry Creek Reservoir. Are there any others that we can think of close by?
Bear Creek.
Bear Creek. Okay, why are those reservoirs important? What do we use them for?
Flood control.
Flood control as well as what? Drinking water. Okay, they do feed into our drinking water system as well. So I mentioned the fact that I like to hear, I don't like snow down here because I don't like having to shovel my walk. That's really what it comes down to. But when I think of it snowing up in the mountains, it makes me feel better because I know that's going to affect our water availability later on in the year, right? I mean, that's eventually what we're going to get our water from. And that's why when we hear things like, in the last few years, we've had these huge burns like the Bailey fires and the Hayman fires and stuff like that. People have been up in arms because it's affected the watershed when you get those really hot burns, and it actually causes erosion to happen because it's killed so much of the plants that have stabilized the soil, and that ends up in the creeks and the rivers and stuff. That affects our water quality. So all of this is very much tied to it. So a program like the
Pond mucking.
Pond mucking or mucking in the pond or whatever.
Pond
Yeah.
exploration.
Yeah, I mean something like that is really kind of, it's something that we don't think of water that, I don't think of water that often in Colorado, to be honest. I mean, it's not, you know, we just don't have a lot of it. So you see a lot of different things when you get into that water system. Okay. All right. Well, let's go into some specifics with respect to ecology. Let's talk about, I said ecosystems, I'm gonna grab my water here. Ecosystems, or the term ecosystem could be used synonymously with habitat or environment. I mentioned at the beginning of my discussion that I'm a community ecologist. By definition, that's the level of ecology I work at. An ecosystem ecologist would be working at a more inclusive level than myself. Okay, ecosystem is a huge concept because not only does it take all of the organisms living in an area, but it also takes into consideration those abiotic factors. Okay, so you have to start looking at water. You have to start looking at temperature, soil pH, etc. So it's a more inclusive level than a population and a community. So can somebody tell me what a population is?
It's like the number of a certain species.
Okay.
They can produce offspring.
It's not number, not necessarily a number. Okay, you meant to say that again?
Like a collection of organisms that can produce offspring.
Yeah, and I wouldn't define it that way, but you're right, because you were more, what makes us humans?
Our opposable thumb.
It's really good for more on our cell phones now, right? What is it that defines us as humans? One of the most basic fundamental things that makes us humans and not cats or dogs or whatever. What can we do that we couldn't do with a cat or a dog successfully?
Procreate?
We can make offspring. A species, we're a species because we can produce fertile, viable offspring with other members of our species. That's what the species definition is. So a population is comprised of one species. You were right in the sense that they're individuals that can produce offspring. It's one species in a given area. So it's not necessarily a number. You could look at density, okay, which would be looking at numbers. But by definition, a population is a group of organisms in an area of the same species, just one species. And I could say we're a population of humans in this room, and that would be fine. There's what, 15 of us in here? We could expand that and say, okay, the population of us in addition to all the people in the Littleton area. Okay, we can set arbitrary boundaries to a population, whatever we want those to be. The population of waterfowl that that are at, on the reservoir at any given time. Okay. A community is more inclusive. So what do you think a community is?
All the different species in that area?
Exactly. It's multiple species in a given area. It's an assemblage of species. But notice in both of those definitions, we've just talked about species, individuals, living organisms. Ecosystem goes bigger because in addition to the community, it also takes into consideration the non-living factors. Okay? Okay. All right, I want to spend just a little bit of time on this image. And I think you can see it, right, in your notes? Okay. Technically, I no longer have permission from Benjamin Cummings to make big copies of these, so don't tell anybody. All right. So, when we talk about, because we're going to start talking about specific ecosystems as they relate to the Chatfield, Colorado, and specifically the Chatfield region. And you're going to talk a little bit about food webs. I think you're going to do a game at the end too. When we talk about production on the planet, primary producers, how many of you guys have heard of primary producers before? Right? What are we talking about with respect to what's being produced by primary producers?
Nutrients?
Food. So a plant would be an example of a primary producer. Primary refers to first, produce, and it's production of food. Okay? We are not producers as animals. We're what? Consumers. And we're not even, well, it depends on where you meet on the food chain. We can be a variety of levels of consumers. But a primary producer is going to be, when we talk about primary production, we're talking about food being made. So this picture is talking about net primary production. We would all prefer to take home our gross paychecks, right? But we don't get to. So when we look at it from an ecosystem level, we don't really focus that much on gross primary production. Okay, a plant may make this much sugar throughout the year, but that plant is making that sugar to feed itself, right? So it's not available really other to, you know, than to do cellular respiration and kind of normal metabolic activities. Net primary production is dealing with what's available to the consumer at the next level. Okay, what can be then assimilated by whatever comes and eats this, either directly or indirectly. So if we look at, and one of the things I want to show you is if we look at these names, open oceans, kind of and continental shelf, those are anomalies. But if we look at desert and semi-desert scrub, tropical rainforest, savanna, boreal forest, grassland, shrubland, woodland, what do all of those names have in common? Plants. Ecosystems are named for plants. Okay? Because plants are going to be, on a terrestrial ecosystem, on land, going to be those primary producers. Okay? So if we look at this first part of this graph, we're looking at the percentage of the Earth's surface area. Well, it's not rocket science. What is most of the Earth covered in?
Water.
Water. And really what kind of water? Yeah, open ocean. Okay? The majority of the Earth's surface, 65% give or take, is open ocean. Okay? So almost 2/3. That's crazy when you think the next most abundant ecosystem is continental shelf, and it's 5.2%. Okay? From 65% down to 5.2%. And then we start chipping away. And if you think of things like lakes and streams, okay, 0.3%, swamps and marshes, 0.4%. Okay, well that's kind of interesting, kind of chipping away as we go down. But if we go to that B component of this, what do we notice happens dramatically to open ocean? Its sparse shrinks dramatically, right? Look at how small it is now. So are open oceans productive? No. Okay, an open ocean is going to be deep. Okay, and for the majority of us, and for any ecosystem we're ever going to come into contact, what's the ultimate energy source? The sun. Okay, actually it's the sun, and then it's converted to ATP eventually. The sun. There are new ecosystems that have been discovered on the depths of the oceans that don't rely upon the sun. But in deep open ocean, the sun's energy is going to be washed out pretty quickly. Okay, so it's not going to be able to drive any sort of activity. If you maybe want to put a star by it, coral reefs, that's part of the ocean. Algal beds, kelp forests, that's part of the ocean, but they're considered a different ecosystem. They're shallower. Okay, they're not open ocean. They're close to the coast. So open ocean's not very productive. What is the most productive ecosystem on the planet? Algal beds and reefs. Kelp forests and coral reefs.
So where is plankton really found then?
Plankton's a general term. Plankton's found, you'd find it in the ponds, you'd find it in streams. Plankton by definition just means small floating life. Phytoplankton is photosynthetic plankton. Zooplankton, consumer plankton. Okay, so if you were to go take a water sample and put it up, pond water samples, like that's my favorite labs because you got to see, it's not as much fun as you can have with a microscope. You're seeing all sorts of things flitting around. Those are all plankton. It's a very general term. Okay. Do I need to stop moving? I'm sorry.
No, you're fine.
So, but number two, somebody mentioned it. What's number two? Rainforest. Tropical rainforest. But if we look at numbers, tropical rainforest is only 3.3% of the Earth's surface, and algal beds and coral reefs, 0.1% of the Earth's surface. But if you put those two things together, okay, well, if you actually just look at tropical rainforest and we go to that C, you actually do have the second largest percentage. The open ocean is number one, but only by a small margin. And when you look at 65%, versus, what is it, 3.3%, it's really no contest. Rainforests blow it out, okay? The most productive ecosystem in the state of Colorado is riparian. So where in the state of Colorado would you expect to find the most animals? Riparian, okay? Okay. So just kind of interesting when you start thinking about, if you talk about, I've been working, I don't know if it's ever going to get written. I've been trying to work on a new book for birding in Colorado for a few years now, and I just can't seem to find the time. And one of the things that it focuses on really is kind of the predictability. I mean, it's not a completely new concept, but the predictability. If I want to go see a certain bird in Colorado, I do this meetup now. It's weirdly popular. It's birding and beers. I put beers in the title, and I got all these bird watchers that would never have admitted to being bird. They would never come to an Audubon event, but they love birding because there are beers afterwards. And when they'll ask, can we go see this, or can we go see this? I know where to take people. If they tell me they want to see a certain bird, what do I need to do? Take them to the habitat. Where's their food? It's real easy, right? I mean, if I want to take people out to see bald eagles right now, because we've got a lot more of them in the state, where am I going to take them? To the Arsenal's great, right? That's why the Arsenal became a wildlife refuge to begin with. Bar Lake, Cherry Creek State Park, Chatfield. Okay. Now, I actually took the raptor class last week that was offered here. Kind of interesting. Why would I take them to Cherry Creek State Park, Chatfield State Park, Bar Lake? Because there's water. Because how do bald eagles feed? On fish. But apparently in Colorado they're lazy. I've never seen this. Apparently they just steal food from everybody else. So, which now is interesting. Now I got to create an event for that. But anyways, it's real easy to predict if you want to see certain things in the state of Colorado. Just pick the plants. What do they eat? And go there, and you're going to find them. Okay. If you don't go to where they're going to feed, or where they're going to nest, or whatever, where they're going to migrate through, you're not. Might as well just. It's just not going to be a successful outing. Okay, next slide. So, because you guys are going to do something at the end, we've heard both of these, right? Food chain, food web. Has anybody heard one more than the other?
Chain.
Usually we hear food chain. We talk about the food chain, right? Well, think about a chain of events. It's linear. What's a web?
It branches out.
Tangled. Think of it, what is it, the saying, what a tangled web we weave, whatever the end of that is. Think of a spider web. Yeah, it may be circular, but more than anything, there's all sorts of parts to it. So just think linear versus intertwined. They are not the same thing. Okay? So, and I knew these weren't going to be very big, but you can kind of get the picture. Okay, we can look at the food chain of an owl. Great horned owls out here. We're talking about, Polly was talking about it earlier. Great horned owl is a consumer. And it's actually a predator, a top predator. Okay, it's not on the same level as a cow at all. Okay, it's going to eat further up on the food chain. And so, but its food originally is going to come from where?
Plants.
The plants. Okay, so the plant is at what level? Primary producer. So the plant makes food for itself, but this darn grasshopper comes in and starts eating on the plant. Okay, that's a primary consumer. Grasshopper gets taken out by a mouse. That mouse is now what type of consumer? Secondary consumer. And here comes this owl, this nice silent feathers swooping down in the dark of night, taking out that mouse, and it's a tertiary consumer. You would be hard pressed to find a food chain picture that goes beyond tertiary consumer. Maybe quaternary, maybe. It's rare. Why? Why don't we see 4th, 5th, 6th level consumers? Anybody know?
Because man kills them all.
No. Where would we be actually? Let's say we're going to come into this. Let's say we like to eat mice or insects or whatever. I don't know. I've had crickets before for sure. Where would we be?
Well, we eat plants. I mean, so we could be a primary. We could be at any level of that.
Yeah. Is anybody in here a vegetarian? Or okay. Well, depending. Are you vegan? If you're a strict vegan, for sure, you're what level? Consumer. Primary. Okay. If you're an ovo-lacto vegetarian, Well, the eggs actually came from further up. So now you're a secondary consumer. Okay? And milk would be in the same level. If you're a pescatarian, well, it depends on what fish you're eating. Because that fish may be further up. There was I'll never forget that, you know, what is it, like 95% of what we hear? 95% of what you hear tonight you're going to forget as soon as you hit the door. Or you've already forgotten it. But I remember this one lecture where I was taking an environmental bio class in grad school. And my professor said, if you want to minimize toxins in your body, the easiest way to do it is to eat lower on the food chain. And it is. I mean, you know, it's because you're not having as many, it's not bioaccumulation isn't happening as much. So it really does depend. But anyway, so the tertiary consumer. And then the fungi, one of the things that's key, guys, is decomposers are the link. Go muck around and look for fungi. Go under a fallen log and break it up and see if you see all sorts of white threads under there. Okay? Decomposers link all trophic levels, and without them, nothing, I mean, many of the leaves, how many of you guys didn't pick up all your leaves in your yard this fall? Most of them are gone by now. A lot of them were blown away, but most of them are gone because they've been decomposed. If we didn't have decomposers, they would never go away. Okay? And to answer that question, the reason we don't see a higher level is because there's not enough energy that's going from each level up to sustain a fourth and fifth level. Okay? Only about 10% of the energy makes it from here to here, and then from there to there. And so you kind of run out of usable energy as you move up. Well, a food web, I didn't find one with an owl, but another bird of prey, that's a better rendition of it. Because depending upon what you're eating in your meal, you could be at different levels in that food chain. Okay? And so it's much more interconnected. And I think that this is, you know, something too when you talk about the animals that you see. Well, what are they doing out there? Why are they there? You know, grasshoppers actually eat more grass on this planet every year than any other animal out there. Okay? They're by far the biggest grazers in terms of annual consumption. You'd think it would be cows or wildebeest or something like that, but it's grasshopper. Okay. So here we come to that interconnectedness again. We talked about watersheds being linked. Now we're talking about food webs being linked. All of it's interdependent. That's what I love about it. That's why I was drawn to ecology. I was really drawn to being able to, I loved being out in the, you know, out in nature and looking at things and going, why is it doing that? And watching it, being able to figure it out and piece it together. And every time I'm outside, I learn something new. And you know, you just get these deeper levels of connectedness, and I think that's what's so fantastic about it. Okay. Should we? It's been an hour. Should we let it? Do you guys take breaks?
Yeah.
Quick breaks. This will be
Do you
good.
guys
This
want
will
a
be
break
good.
now?
Like, or stretch your legs.
Yeah, let's do
Yeah.
a 5-minute bathroom break.
I can listen to myself all day long. I mean, real ecosystems that are in Chatfield, and we'll see where we're at. If we're good on time, then I'll cover a little bit more. But what's interesting about Colorado is forests being tall trees, we don't find them all over the state. Okay, so we get forests from about 5,600 feet in elevation to 11,000 feet. Does anybody know the elevation here? Is it high? It's got to be higher than Denver, right?
I think it's higher than Denver.
So what, maybe 5,500 feet or something? Okay. But notice, we're still below that 5,600 feet. So how many tree lines do we have in Colorado? You might know what a tree line is? We have two. Yeah, a lower and an upper. Okay, which is interesting. We actually start, we're starting below forests here, and then if we go up to the alpine tundra, we get beyond them as well. Okay, so we have two tree lines in Colorado. Well, it's the abiotic factors that dictate what plants grow where. So at the lower elevations, if you think about Pawnee National Grasslands or any of the eastern plains, eastern 40% of the state, it's too darn dry for trees. That's why they don't grow there. I live in Park Hill in Denver. Sometimes when I'm walking my dog, I find it hard to believe that before people moved there, none of those trees existed. Some of the oldest trees in Denver are by the Denver Botanic Gardens. Okay? Because there's not enough water. Unless you're in a riparian corridor, you're not getting tall trees in the eastern 40% of the state. And then if we go up to the alpine tundra, we got in the car right now, and we could drive to the top of Mount Evans, what would definitely be different? Temperature would be colder, for sure. What else? It would probably be what? I'd be willing to bet money on it.
Lots of snow.
Snowing.
It'd be snowier. It would definitely be windier. Okay? So at the higher elevations, it's too cold, it's too windy, and actually the too windy makes it too dry. Okay? I just did a hike a couple of weeks ago up to Guanella Pass, which from the George, it's closed, the road.
Was
So
it
you-
open when you went?
No, you had to hike the 2 miles. We went up to see to find ptarmigan, which was my nemesis bird up until last year, and now I've seen them in both summer and winter plumage. But I was astounded because I'd never really been up in the alpine tundra in the winter. When we got up to the summit of the road of Guanella Pass, the road was dry. There was no snow on the road. Why?
The wind.
Blown all down. So actually the wettest ecosystem in the state of Colorado is the Engelmann spruce fir ecosystem because there are trees there and it catches the snow that's been blown down. The alpine tundra really does get the most annual precipitation, but it's really dry because the wind blows it down, and also that wind has a drying effect. I was actually astounded. I was like, that's super cool. I've never actually seen it. The road was like nothing. Okay. So we already mentioned ecosystems are named for their dominant plant species. So let's relate that. Well, before that, we'll talk about Chatfield. Yeah, go ahead. Chatfield Basin. I mentioned that brochure, flip through that. There's some really interesting tidbits in there. The Chatfield Basin, we've got Audubon societies right here. We go up a little ways. Denver Botanic Gardens has a site here. I mean, there's all sorts of organizations that are out here because of the ecological richness of the area. I was just out at Cherokee Ranch a couple weeks ago. Has anybody ever been out there just near Castle Pines? It's fantastic, yeah. Same sort of thing. I could look and see Chatfield Reservoir from there. But what you have, and the reason why it's such an interesting area, is because you've got the Rocky Mountains meeting the Eastern Plains, okay, the high plains. You've got southern desert lands meeting the northern boreal forest. So you've got this intersection of 4 major ecological regions in one small area. So it's an important bird area in Chatfield Reservoir, or Chatfield Basin. It's like one of the top areas in this nation for butterflies. Who knew? Okay. I mean, it's ridiculous what all is down here. We've got some endangered species, etc. So, okay. So if we look at the major ecosystem types in Colorado, I went ahead and put 4 stars because those 4 are the ones you're going to encounter in the Chatfield Basin. Okay? That's what those stars indicate. And then if you want to put another star by riparian, kind of as the other group, that list from grasslands down to alpine tundra is increasing in elevation. Okay? Increasing in elevation. So grasslands are going to be typically at the lowest elevation. We don't really have grasslands on the western slope. It'd be replaced by shrublands, but you get the idea. Okay? The reason why riparian is the other group is because we get riparian at all elevations. Okay? At all elevations. So grasslands, riparian, again riparian means near water. Shrublands, pinyon, pine, juniper, woodlands. Notice that does not say forest. Okay? Montane forest, which has several different subcategories. Subalpine forest, and then alpine tundra. It's going to be our highest elevation ecosystem in the state. So when you look at Chatfield Basin, 2,150 surface acres of water, 270 miles of streams. Talked about water being important. There is a fair amount of water here. It's why this area is so ecologically rich. Okay, that water ties it together. So you get forest, you get shrubland, grassland, and riparian. And I already said, riparian, if you want to see the most stuff, you want to hear the most sounds, go to the riparian ecosystem. You will hear the most activity in that ecosystem. Okay? So in the area, it's the highest priority for protection because of that ecological importance. And then the grasslands are the most highly susceptible to development. If we're in grasslands areas in this part of the state, What does that probably tell you a little bit about the topography?
Flat.
Flat. Really good for urbanization. I mean, it's where that correlates to. It's easier to build on. Okay. So, tie it to the animals. If you feed them, they will come. Where you have more food, you've got more animals. So we've already answered that. What Colorado ecosystems? Well, first of all, we already know which one is the top. What Colorado ecosystem is going to have the highest animal diversity?
Riparian.
Riparian. Where else would you expect to see a lot?
The Engelmann spruce.
Riparian system in an Englewood spruce forest.
Huh?
Is it riparian system in an Englewood spruce forest?
Why? You both said Engelmann spruce. Why?
Because it's the wettest.
Because it's the wettest. Except for the fact that it's not very diverse in terms of plant diversity. You have 2 dominant trees. So it is a very good, guess.
It's pretty logical too that the Aborigines here primarily lived in the riparian area.
Yeah.
Because that's where the food, both plant and animal.
Yeah, and if you think about where have we built? Think about humans. When we build cities, why do we pick locations?
Water.
Water, and also materials, right? Where are our biggest cities in the state?
Along the front range.
Along the front range at the foothills, right? Right at the base of the mountains, basically. And so the reason in Chatfield Basin we're here on the plains as we go east, but if we look west, all of a sudden the elevation increases really quickly. And it's that short section that you get the second highest species diversity, where you get shrublands and the forest coming in. Because if we go do any if we go hike Waterton Canyon, we're going to hit forest if we go all the way up to the top, but we're going to pass through shrublands and stuff like that on not a very far of a hike. So it's kind of in that foothill area as well. And again, because we've got all these different, that intersection of 4, we also have animals coming in from lots of different regions as well. Interesting, blue jays. You ever know what the actual blue jay? We also have other jays that are blue in the state of Colorado. That species become more common in the last decade or so because urbanization has allowed it to move its range westward. Cardinals are being found in the state, northern cardinals. I love that bird. I'm actually really psyched about it. But again, because of urbanization. The Eurasian collared dove, the first one I ever saw was in 1996 at a McDonald's in Starkville, Mississippi, parking lot. It was about as far west as that bird was at that time. I remember the first one I saw in Park Hill was like 3 or 4 years ago. Now you see them all over the state. So it's that urbanization is also kind of compounding that as well. Okay. So if you look at the plants and you gain an appreciation for the plants, it starts telling you the story. Is there a lot of water here? Okay. Like if I were looking at, is everybody familiar with ponderosa pine? The tree ponderosa pine. So let's say we're out at Genesee. Have you guys all been to the Bison Overlook? When you look out at that Bison Overlook, what do you notice about that area there? Can you envision it? It's ponderosa pine out there, but there's also a lot of what? Meadow. It's not a lot of trees close together. We go up to the Engelmann spruce, fir, and we start looking at that. All of a sudden the trees are much closer together. Why? What allows those trees to crowd?
Not as much water down where the ponderosas are.
Exactly. There's more water. That's what allows us, because trees are they're competitors. I mean, just like anything else. Competition is going to dictate how close plants grow to one another. If you've got greater spacing, less water. Okay? If they're all jammed together, it's probably pretty darn wet. So you can start looking at it and seeing, and it's cooler when you hike in the Engelmann spruce forest because it's crowded and therefore shady. Okay? Feel north slope versus south slope. Very different in terms of temperature. You can walk across the street and do it from a south-facing slope to a north-facing slope and feel the temperature drop 10 degrees right away, just because of slope exposure. Okay, so as a result, if you start paying attention to the plants and the dominant plants, You'll get much better as a naturalist, as a general wildlife enthusiast, etc., at predicting what animals you should see. Okay? Because they're inextricably linked. Okay. So let's talk about Chatfield. Grasslands. It's kind of hard to really see it. I mean, I think it's a little bit easier. You do have grasslands. I guess if we were out at the Denver Botanic Garden site, it'd be easier to envision the grasslands there, right? Okay, so we do have grasslands. By definition, grasslands are devoid of trees. They're a treeless landscape. Why don't trees grow there?
It's a grassland.
Right. Why is it a grassland? Too dry. Too dry. On average, the eastern plains gets less than 20 inches of annual precipitation a year. Less than 20 inches. It's pretty darn dry. Okay. Most of that is in fall, winter, early spring. And how many of you guys have green grass right now if you've got grass at your house or wherever you live? No, it's dormant. It's not really benefiting from this water that we're getting. Okay, so extensive below 5,600 feet. Now what's interesting is here, really, in the Chatfield Basin, you're going to get, you're not going to have mountain grasslands per se because of the fact that those are bigger tracts, but you do get a mix of the short grass prairie species as well as some of the higher elevation grassland species like big blue stem, the tall grass species. They need more water. Okay. Who's been there?
Those are the buttes.
Yeah, Pawnee Buttes. So if you've never really gotten into admiring good grasslands in the state of Colorado, you should. I remember I spent a summer working in Kansas, and I was like, if I never have to see another grassland again, I'll be happy. Until I gained an appreciation for how hard it is to be a grass. And then all of a sudden I was like, oh, that's pretty cool. So this is the Pawnee Buttes. That picture, I always get kind of sad when I see this. That picture I could not take anymore.
Yeah.
It's all wind farms on that ridge now.
And it has the gas.
Yeah.
It's a sad drive.
Yeah. But still a really neat place. And so again, what do you notice? A lack of trees. 3 trees. Okay? All right. This would be a mountain grassland. You may know, maybe kind of guess as to where that is?
South Park.
South Park. Okay? Now, to get to South Park, what do we have to do? We have to drive. I'm not going to walk it.
Go over a mountain.
Go over a mountain pass, right? So we're definitely up in higher elevation. And if you'll notice, I took this picture on purpose from the parking lot. There are trees. And if I look along the sides here, there are trees. There are trees. So I'm high enough for tree growth. But what is not growing in there?
Trees.
Well, why not?
Dry.
It's something. It's actually probably there too cold. It's in a depression, and that cooling effect that you get in that. And so, or the growing season's a little too short, etc. And so there, it's probably not that it's too dry. It's just other things that are now kind of filtering in. But the net result's the same. They don't grow. Okay? All of our parks, North Park, South Park, Estes Park, they're named.
In the San Luis Valley.
Yeah, exactly. When you're going into the sand dunes, exactly. Their parks are mountain grasslands. Okay, they're all mountain grasslands. Okay, so let's go to the next slide, Sturdy. So if you think about characteristics, we've talked about it being dry, especially in the plains grasslands, so they're very well adapted to the dry climate. Okay, they're, by definition, if you want to use xeriscate plants that are natives, anything native to the short grass prairie ecosystem of Colorado is going to do well. They've been evolved in that landscape. Okay, most are perennial, extensive root systems. It's one of the things, like I said, I teach at the Denver Botanic Gardens, and I do focus a lot on native plants. One of the things I always say is you have to be somewhat patient when you go with natives because they take a while. Oftentimes if you start with small plants, it may be a couple of years before you really get good growth, and it's because they're putting all their energy in developing that root system so they can really tap into the water in that dry area that they're used to. Now what's interesting is most species, think of grasses, have narrow blades or narrow leaves or finely divided leaves and grow upright. Let's see if I have it, if I left it in there. Did I? The next
Picture?
Yeah. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Trivia question. Does anybody know what that grass is?
On the left, Grandma.
Blue grama. And what do we know about blue grama?
It's our state grass.
It's our state grass. Okay, it's our state grass. Blue Brahma has very narrow grass blades and straight up and down. Another really common plant, you'll actually see this at all elevations in the state. It's actually a circumpolar plant, so you can see it just about anywhere you go in the world. It's yarrow, achillea. Now, yarrow, the reason I put this in here is, again, we've got pretty narrow leaves, but also finely divided. And one of the things I always find interesting, maybe you could get kids excited about it, is having people look at plants for hairs. And the technical name for plant hair is trichome, T-R-I-C-H-O-M-E. The majority, trichome means hair. The majority of the plants that are native to our shortgrass prairie ecosystem have hairs on them. They're hairy. There must be a reason for it.
To catch water.
It's not to catch water.
Sun.
It provides some shading, for sure. It also, it's not pollination, it actually creates a cooling effect. One is it helps trap evaporation, you know, as those water particles as they're evaporating, kind of got hairs there. In addition, when wind goes over that, we talked about how windy that area is, causes air turbulence at the leaf surface, which is a cooling effect. It's like a fan. So there's multiple aspects to it. And then that growing straight up and down, that's important because if you've got a leaf that's straight up and down like this, when is it hottest during the day? In the middle of the day, right? When the sun's directly overhead. And if the sun's directly overhead, now less of the surface area of the plant's exposed to the sun. As the sun, we'll pretend this is the east. As the sun's rising, it's cooler, more direct sunlight, heat of the day, and then as it's setting and it's cooler, more sun absorption. Okay? Form, fitting, function, that's the key there. All right. Lots of grasses, lots of plants, lots of herbaceous plants, non-woody plants because we lack those trees. So you get a lot of herbivores in grasslands. Okay? What are some examples? I was thinking we were, I just looked at the clock, sorry. It's only 7:25. Okay, we're good on time. All right, perfect. I was thinking we had like 15, 20 minutes.
No.
Okay. We can make it 15.
We go until 9.
Okay. That I just like really just looked at that and I was sorry. Give me some examples of some herbivores.
Antelope.
Bison.
Bison, pronghorn antelope. What did somebody say something else?
Rabbits.
Rabbits. What else?
Prairie dog.
Prairie dogs. Any others?
Beavers?
Huh?
Beavers?
Yeah, but they're not going to be in the grasslands.
Okay.
But so we'll come back to beavers. That's okay. What did I say is going to be the herbivore that consumes the greatest amount of grass? Grasshoppers. Grasshoppers. Any of the insects, basically, that are chewing on that. You know, beetles, etc. Ants. Ants are probably ecologically the most important. They exert a tremendous selective pressure on grassland ecosystems. So very, very important. Yeah, I know. I just looked at it too. Right. You used to tell my students, if you don't know the answer, just look at the PowerPoint. It's usually on the slide, right? Okay. So you know who? Somebody mentioned prairie dogs. And that's how I feel about it. And I was when I was at Cherry Creek Ranch a couple weeks ago, the guy that was giving us a tour was talking about how ranchers hate prairie dogs, you know. And it really is. It's one of those conversations that gets people fired up. When I taught out at the Community College of Aurora, I always tried to. I'm a slightly opinionated, and so they always were real careful about what committees they put me on. And I remember being in a meeting with a guy that was bragging about how they were getting ready to put in a new parking lot and how they had gone in and had developed this machine to suction the prairie dogs out of the holes and stuff. And I was just like, and the guy was just like. And if you don't like prairie dogs, just keep it to yourself tonight. And that's okay. You know, you're entitled to your opinion. But one of the things I told him, because he was like, they're just vermin. And I was like, actually, they're not. They're a keystone species. And that's probably one of the most important facets of prairie dogs. They are a keystone species. And if you don't know what a keystone species is, what that means is it's a species that a disproportionate number of other species depend upon it. There are over 120 different species of organisms in Colorado that depend upon prairie dogs for their livelihood. Plant, animal combined. Yes, they're a disturbance factor, okay? But that disturbance is important. And for me, one of my favorite things to go find in the state are burrowing owls. And burrowing owls, has everybody seen this? Has anybody ever seen this? To me, don't they look like little football players? I always just, like he's got his little helmet on, his little long legs, his little tights. Prairie dogs, their burrowing activity is key to burrowing owls. If you want to find burrowing owls, you have to go to prairie dog colony, okay, for the most part. I mean, all sorts of things. And so if we remove prairie dogs, and they have been removed, I mean, it's just part of the urbanization process, you get this cascading effect. Normally, if you remove a species from the environment, something will just come in and replace it. That's not the case with prairie dogs. And I always kind of thought from a conservation perspective, what we should really be focusing on from a conservation point of view is things like keystone species, because if you protect them, you get this whole kind of umbrella effect associated with them. I think they're great. I love them. But I'm biased too, so anyways, okay. All right, well, beaver, next slide. Yep. Okay. Riparian ecosystem. So again, near water. So where you have ponds, streams, reservoirs, etc. Here, we would be in lowland riparian. Does anybody know what tree is dominant? And by dominant, that means most abundant by biomass. Cottonwood, plains cottonwood. Okay. If we go up into the mountain riparian ecosystems, that's going to change. Still going to be members of the willow family, which is what includes the cottonwood, but you're also going to get things, and not really a dominant tree, but things like Colorado blue spruce, and a lot more shrubs, like fruit-bearing shrubs and stuff up in the mountain riparian. And then aquatic. And for those of you guys, I usually never talk about aquatic ecosystems, so I'm not going to dwell on it here, but if you're doing something like walk the wetlands or this buck in the pond, whatever, you know, you can read up on that in that book that I mentioned at the beginning. Well, we're seeing the activity of a mammal in that photo. What mammal is it? Beaver. The beaver. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay. So again, actually you will also get aspen at the higher elevation. That would be mountain riparian on the left, and then lowland riparian on the right. I think that's actually might be Bar Lake State Park. Bar Lake, has anybody been out here? Bar Lake State is so low right now. I know, it's crazy. Okay. So the plants, well, let me ask you this question. If it was light outside, if we were to go outside to where the cottonwoods are at, just outside, would we be able to find any green leaves?
Leaves?
Leaves, right? We might be able to find brown leaves on the ground, maybe some dangling on some branches. So the cottonwood is an example of a deciduous species, right? Which would be the opposite of the evergreens that we're talking about with the conifers. And that's going to pretty much be the case if we were to follow a river or a creek up the mountains, like Plum Creek or something. The trees and the shrubs right along the edge aren't going to have leaves right now. What does that tell you about those plant communities? What does that tell you about deciduous plants versus our conifers that are evergreen?
Need more water.
They need more water. That's why they grow in an area with a more or less continuous supply of water. Okay? It's one of the reasons why, if you have trees in your yard, to get them established, you have to water them a lot. Deciduous trees. I mean, they just require a lot more water. Conifers, it's a whole different discussion, but the ecology of a gymnosperm, a conifer, like a pine or a spruce, all sorts of modifications to keep them in a condition that maintains drought tolerance. Whether it's thick waxy cuticle, needle-like leaves, etc. Having a big broadleaf leaf you have to get rid of it in the winter. Okay, it's pretty dangerous for the plant. That's why they do it. It's risky to keep it. But those deciduous species are going to require more water. Okay. So we talked about cottonwood being the dominant in lowland riparian. Your understory species, willows. Is anybody here really fond of willows? There's like a whole key on willows the Colorado Native Plant Society puts out. Apparently you can only really identify them if you've got them in the reproductive state. So a very short window throughout the year. Very difficult plant family, very diverse in the state. Alder, and then fruiting species, things like the plum, the currants, etc. So notice I said plum, currant. What do those two plants do?
Flower.
They flower and then fruit. That's another reason why these areas are so chock full of animals, the fruit-bearing species as well. Okay? And you notice as well, you get quite a good diversity of understory, so there's a lot of habitat heterogeneity too in riparian ecosystems. A lot more structural differences, and that creates a variety of habitats as well for nesting and hiding and all sorts of other things. When you get into mountain, it's going to be cottonwood as well, not the plains cottonwood, and then alder, birch, willows, our state tree, the Colorado blue spruce, and also some firs. So what does that tell you about blue spruce and fir as a conifer?
They need more water.
They need a lot of water, and fir is way up at top, okay, with the Engelmann spruce. And so you'll see them lower in elevation when they're in a riparian setting. And I've talked about this, I think I've reiterated this point. Because of the habitat diversity in the riparian ecosystem, you're going to have the greatest diversity of animal communities. And they're important migratory stopovers. I was talking about birding. If I want to go try to find some unique species during spring migration in the state of Colorado, I'm going to go birding in riparian areas. That's where I'm going to have the greatest amount of luck finding things. That's where those birds tend to seek shelter and kind of use, the food there helps them fuel. And again, that trivia was 4% of the state of Colorado is covered in riparian ecosystem, but 95% of the animals that live here use it at some point in their life. Very, very important. Okay. So I'm always a fan of trivia. Of course, I never get these trivia questions on my when I play trivia, but what is the largest rodent in North America?
Beaver.
The beaver. What's a scientific name of beaver? I always think it just sounds smarter when you use scientific names, right? Castor canadensis. C-A-S-T-O-R is the genus, and then canadensis, C-A-N-A-D-E-N-S-I-S. Okay. Beavers, we talked about prairie dogs being disproportionate in their ability to exert pressure on an ecosystem because they're a keystone species. Well, beavers would be similar. They're not keystone species, but they exert tremendous pressure by being what are called ecosystem engineers. Okay? They engineer the environment. That's something you can ask kids too. When you think of an engineer, what do engineers do? Build things. At least that's, unless you're a chemical. Well, I guess even as a chemical engineer, you build things, right? Okay? So what they do is they transform the landscape. They engineer the landscape. We saw that beaver dam a moment ago. Okay. So, is there a beaver den in the lodge? Yeah, a lodge. Okay. So they're found in riparian areas, all elevate, basically throughout the state, as long as it's material for them to build their dens and their lodges. And the engineer component really comes from the damming that they do. So cutting down those trees. I used to live in Glendale, and I used to bike the Cherry Creek Trail a lot. Have any of you guys ever walked that or biked it or whatever? You see it, the cottonwoods have the big metal cages around them. Because why? Beavers. They really like that soft wood. And one of my favorite stories, I don't like to watch the evening news because it really depresses me, but one of my favorite stories ever, I just happened to catch a good day on the evening news, this was years ago. One of my favorite stories, and this was when I still lived in Glendale, was they were getting ready to do some construction at the Glendale water treatment plant, and they were going to have to displace the beavers during this, the resident population there. So they had put a call out saying, would anybody like these beavers? They're free to a good home, basically. And these ranchers up in the mountains said, we'll take them. Yes, please, give them to us. Why did they do that?
Cuts down their trees for free.
Not that they cut down their trees, they're ranchers. So what do they have?
Cows.
And what is
Cows.
The water.
And they didn't own the water. So put some beavers there, let them create a little pond, and now it's a watering hole for their cattle and it's free. I thought it was a brilliant example of using, I mean, that's a natural process. You can't fault the beavers, they're going to do it if you put them up there. I never heard the end of it, I never saw the follow-up story, but I just thought it was great that these ranchers were like, heck yeah, we'll take them, we need more beavers on our property. But really interesting animals with respect to what they do. Yeah, I think they're fascinating, so just to watch it. And to see the, what goes on to them creating that lodge and everything as well. Okay. All right, shrublands. Shrublands are actually, especially the montane shrublands that we have here in the foothills, are also another really good area if you want animal activity to go to. Okay? Now, what's the difference between a tree and a shrub? Height, typically. I had a dendrology professor tell me that if you can walk under it, it's a tree. If you have to walk around it, it's a shrub. Well, there are plenty of trees that have branches too low to walk under it. But the idea, and you're absolutely right, typically shrubs don't get higher than 15 feet in height, and they usually have multiple stems at the base. That's why you can't walk under it. Trees are going to be usually, not always, one stem at the base and taller than 15 feet. So are shrublands forests? No, of course not, because then they'd be called forests, right? Okay. So trees are going to be, they're not going to have trees. The shrubs are going to be shorter. It's going to be a shorter landscape. But they are shrubs, which aren't grasses. They're woody. So what does that tell you about shrublands versus grasslands? Plains grasslands. Or water. So if we were driving from Kansas west along I-70, at what exit should we stop at to get our first really nice exposure to shrublands on I-70? Morrison exit. Morrison exit. If you stop at the Morrison exit and you get out of your car and you look east, minus Denver, we could look all the way to Kansas City, and it's basically plains grasslands. We turn west, and we've got elevation, goes up, and now we've got shrubs. So there is a correlation with water and elevation in this state. The higher you go, the more water you get. Typically. There's always exceptions to prove rule. The higher you go, the more water you get. So we're getting more water at those shrublands, but not enough to grow what? Trees yet. Okay? And in the state of Colorado, we have 3 types of shrublands: semi-desert, sagebrush, and montane. And what we're going to be dealing with in this Chatfield Basin is montane. And that picture is of one of the codominants in montane shrublands. Does anybody know what it is? Mountain mahogany. One of my favorite native plants. Mountain mahogany. Cercocarpus montanus. See, it just rolls off the tongue. It's a great, great plant. If we are on the eastern slope and we go north of Morrison, it pretty much, the montane shrublands become pure stands of mountain mahogany. What's its codominant? Do we know?
The Morrison area or Morrison?
South of the Morrison area. North of Morrison, it's going to be by itself. It's pretty much pure stands. No? Gamble oak. Our only native oak in the state of Colorado, gamble oak. Okay. So the left picture is gamble oak. Roxborough State Park, I think, is, and Bear Creek. great for this. And if you want to go expose yourself to this ecosystem with great scenic, beautiful hikes, Roxborough State Park, directly across this, I think it's the South Rim Trail that leads across the street. To me, that's one of my favorite spots in the state because you actually really have nice stands, trees of gamble oak that are actually above your head, and you don't see that very often. And you really see on that trail, if you go up the South Rim Trail, as you start moving up in elevation, what happens to the height of the gamble oak because of the wind exposure, and it starts getting replaced with mountain mahogany at the top of it. And so mountain mahogany can actually withstand drier conditions when they're together in the same place. It's another picture of mountain mahogany, and then sagebrush shrubland. So if you've ever driven from Silverthorne up to Steamboat Springs, that whole area basically is sagebrush shrublands. Okay.
So would this area around here with all of the rabbit brush be considered a shrub?
Rabbit brush is a it's not really woody. It can get woody though. Rabbit brush is a little confusing. First of all, there are lots of different subspecies of it. I think it would technically fall into the shrub category. It's not really considered it is dominant out here. It's what you have all over the place out there. But it's not really a true ecosystem dominant. It's kind of like a local dominant. And who knows what all has gone on out here in the interim. But yeah, it's very common. And you see a lot of rabbit brush too in the sagebrush shrublands as well. But by biomass, typically, it's not because of the wood, etc. I think that's why you still see it a lot. It's just not considered one of the dominants. Okay. So again, you get large areas of Colorado. If you go on the western slope, you'll get stuff there as well. But semi-desert, sagebrush, and then montane is what we have here in Chatfield Basin. Okay. So gamble oak, Quercus gambeli. Again, that's an interesting little point. It's the only native oak in the state. I guess historically, maybe they think bur oak was here, but right now, this is it. So on the western slope, you get a lot greater distribution. On the eastern slope, we get mountain mahogany. And like I said, if you go north of Morrison, Colorado, on the eastern slope, you really don't have gamble oak anymore. It's replaced by pure stands of mountain mahogany. Okay. So, this is a deciduous, the montane shrublands are a deciduous ecosystem. So that, it's one of the, again, I mentioned it's an area that you get a lot of activity in. And much of that has to do with the fact that you're getting rapidly recycling of nutrients because those leaves are being dropped. And then decomposing and then feeding other things. So you get a really big, you mentioned insects, it's a really good area for insect diversity. And insects are going to be food for what? Birds. Okay, insectivorous birds. Okay. So you get an abundance of animals as a result. So, in addition to the fact that gamble oak drops its leaves, it also produces those decent-sized acorns, which are also food for animals. Okay, so it is a good area to go watch wildlife. One of my favorite birds in that area is what kind of bird is that? Spotted toady, right? My first instinct is always still to call it the rufous-sided toady because I learned it that way so many years ago. It's a beautiful bird. I mean, you're hard pressed. Most people that look at it, even if they don't like birds, are kind of like, that's kind of a pretty bird with a red eye and nice buffy on the side. And maybe you've heard it, if you're a birder, maybe you've looked for it, but if you go in like Roxborough State Park or someplace else in the fall, when those leaves have been dropped, or any time of the year when you've got dried leaves, again, that leaf litter becomes a really nice area for hiding insects. So if you're a bird looking for insects, that's where you want to go. And the towhee has a really interesting foraging technique called a double scratch. I call it the towhee two-step. And if you listen, when you're in gamble oak, and you know towhees around, you almost always hear it, and it's this ch-ch, ch-ch. And I've heard people say, I thought that was a bear. Like, that, you know, they never looked closely because they thought it was a bear, you know. And I was like, gosh, I wish bears were that common on hikes. They're not that common. But anyways, and what they're doing is with that real fast double kick, they're kicking the leaves away so that it scares insects out. And so just listen for it the next time you're in that area if you've never heard it before. You have to stop walking, because if you're walking, you're not going to hear it. But it's an interesting component to this ecosystem that you'll hear. Okay. We're okay?
Yeah.
All right. You guys had enough?
No.
Okay. I'm going to talk about the other ecosystems then, since we have some time. Okay. So these are not going to be found in Chatfield Basin. Okay? But I think from a perspective, if you're focusing on one area, as you will be, volunteering here, it's always good to be able to talk about other components of the state as well, and even for your own enjoyment when you go out. So another ecosystem, we were kind of going up in elevation, would be pinyon pine juniper woodlands. So again, not forests. So what does that tell us about this ecosystem compared to, say, Eaglewood spruce? Less water. Okay? We do not have this ecosystem in this part of Colorado. On the eastern slope, if we want to get this ecosystem, we need to drive to Colorado Springs. That's where you pick it up, on the eastern slope. So Garden of the Gods is a great location for pinyon pine juniper. On the western slope, it's well dispersed on the western slope. And you may have heard in the last few years, big problem with a fungal infection on pinyon pine. If you've ever had pine nuts, that's the pine you can thank. That's the species that the pine nut comes from. And one of the other things too, and I usually have cones, when I do the ecosystems, the pinyon pine seeds or pine nuts are expensive, right? When you go buy pine nuts, they're not cheap. And the reason for it is it's a really small cone. So if we look at this cone here, I see max this cone would have had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, maybe 10 pine nuts it would have made in one cone. That's why if you've ever driven through the Four Corners region of the state or down in southern Colorado, northern New Mexico in the fall, you see people harvesting. You see them, and you may not know that's what they were doing, but they're in pinyon pine woodlands getting pine nuts. There's a relict population. If you go up outside of Fort Collins and you drive up the road that goes through what is called Owl Canyon, there's a relict population of pinyon pine. There's some pinyon pine trees on the right side of the highway that are aged to about 400 years old. Completely disconnected from that southern population. Can anybody hypothesize as to how they got there?
Like bird poop?
No? Good guess though. It's a cluster of trees, a pretty good cluster of trees. The idea is probably Native Americans planted them as food source. They took them and said, okay, we're going to be here, and so we're going to plant these trees because it'll be a reliable source of pinyon pine. Juniper, tree juniper, we have several species of juniper, so this would be Juniper scapulorum, is also interesting to me personally because I really like gin. And we can thank juniper berries for gin, right? The other thing, I always say Townsend solitaires. Does everybody know what the Townsend solitaire is? I think they would like gin and tonics as well.
Well, they like the berries.
They definitely like the berries. Townsend solitaires are interesting in that they sing in the winter, which most birds don't because they're defending juniper trees. They're winter food. So you can pretty much guarantee when you see, if you're in a juniper stand and you see this bird way up at the top, in the middle, it's probably a Townsend solitaire. And if you listen, you'll hear them sing. And it's very unusual to hear birds. I mean, they'll make calls and stuff, but actually singing to defend territories, they do it in the winter. So that's, and they do it in the juniper forest. Okay. All right, next are montane forests. So low to middle elevation, 5,500 to 9,000 feet. Again, I mentioned grasslands are extensive below 5,600 feet, so there's some overlap. You know, you're not going to see this distinct break when you go from one ecosystem to the next. So there are 4 dominant trees that make up our montane forest, the top two tend to be codominants at certain elevations. And again, an increasing elevation. Okay? So ponderosa pine, Pinus ponderosa. Douglas fir. Notice the fir, there's a hyphen in that name. That's important because Douglas fir is not a fir. That's why the hyphen is there. And the name, the genus name Suga. Pseudo means false, Suga fir. It'll trick you if you don't know any better. It looks like a fir. In foliage, it doesn't look anything like a fir in cones. And you're not going to mistake the two in elevation. So Pseudotsuga menziesii, and then aspen, Populus tremuloides, that tremulous, that trimmer, quaking aspen, it's in the scientific name. And then lodgepole pine is Pinus contorta. Pinus contorta. Okay. So the first picture on the top left there, I don't know how well it comes from the back. That's ponderosa pine. That would actually be at the Genesee Overlook. What's interesting is when we're driving, okay, we're on that field trip. We're driving I-70 west. We've stopped at the Morrison exit to see our shrublands. We're going to continue on. We're going to increase elevation really quickly to Genesee. We're going to Genesee in about 10 to 15 minutes. We're going to pull over in a park. We're going to walk across the street. We're going to look at our ponderosa pine, which is on the right-hand side of I-70. Those trees are nice and spaced. And then I'm going to tell you guys, look to the left across the highway. And all of a sudden you're going to see trees closer together. And they don't have these nice broad open canopy that we see in ponderosa pine. It looks more like a narrow-topped Christmas tree. Is it the same species? You think? It's growing way closer together and it's very pointed at the top. And this one's flat at the top. Probably not. Can anybody guess as to what it is? It's not spruce yet. But it would be similar in that growth form. What did I say was oftentimes the codominant?
Douglas fir.
Douglas fir. So on the left-hand side of the highway, we've got tons of Douglas fir. On the right-hand side, we've got tons of ponderosa pine. What's different about the two sides of the highway?
Water.
Water. What is the slope aspect of the right-hand side of the road? South. And what's the slope aspect of the left-hand side of the road? North-facing. And north-facing slopes are cooler and wetter. But that increase in moisture is what allows Doug fir to grow. So even though these are codominants, they're technically at the exact same elevation. Douglas fir is more tolerant of dry conditions. Excuse me, ponderosa pine is more tolerant of dry conditions. Douglas fir, wetter. So you typically, elevationally, will pick up ponderosa pine first. Then you get them mixed. And then who tops out? Douglas fir. Okay? Because of water requirements. They're going to have very similar animal compositions because of that. They tend to be in the same areas. Okay. Oh, go back. A couple of trivia things. So I got rid of a lot of slides because I didn't think I was going to get this far. A couple of things about ponderosa pine. If you've never scratched and sniffed a ponderosa pine, do so. People have. I have a hard time. I think it works better on a hot day when the resin is really heated up. But it smells anything like butterscotch to vanilla. And it is a characteristic of the plant. Again, it's got a characteristic reddish trunk, bark to it, something you can see from a distance. And it's different in that it's got the longest needles of any pine in the state, like it can be up to 7 inches long. The next closest is going to be like that long. So it's not even close in overlap. And they tend to have a flatter treetop. Like if you see in all of these in this picture, this is rounded, 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 not pointed like the spruces and the firs and the Doug fir is going to be. Okay? That's something to pay attention to. It's a real easy diagnostic characteristic. Douglas fir is the tree on the bottom right. To me, the easiest way to identify Douglas fir is by the cones. Douglas fir loves to produce cones like pretty much every year, and they're going to be all the way down the tree. And when you look at it, and for those of you guys that have never seen it before, if you look at Douglas fir, this is called a cone scale. Cone scale. This little thing sticking out is I just call it a bract. I don't know if that's a technical term, if I made that up, but I've used it for a long time now. And that bract looks like 2 hind feet of a mouse and a tail. So it looks like a little mouse running into the cone. I've had students say it kind of looks like a snake's tongue going in. It's the only cone that does that, has that. Easy to identify. And it's called a false fir. Firs are friendly. You ever heard that firs are friendly? Spruces are sharp. The fir, the Doug fir, if you go, it's friendly. Feels like a fir, but it's not. They're completely different genera. Okay. Definitely the most photographed spot in the state. One of the most photographed spots in the country. Where is that?
Maroon bells.
Maroon bells. Yeah, I've only been at Maroon bells in the summer. I'd love to get up there. It looks awesome in the fall. What plant am I trying to draw your attention to in this?
Aspen.
So one of the few ecosystems, and it's not, you notice it said bands of aspen, or woodlands. It's not, aspen is a pioneering species. It moves in post-disturbance. So you don't get these nice, predictable concentrations of it, but beautiful fall color. The next species I'm going to talk about, lodgepole pine, which is the species that's just been obliterated by pine beetle in the last few years. I've heard a lot of biologists talk about, they're somewhat interested to see what's going to happen, because guess who's going to move in?
Aspen.
Aspen. And aspen actually is a much more productive ecosystem than lodgepole pine. So in reality, it's better habitat. So if you've been up to Rocky Mountain National Park in the last couple of years, where they've done all the elk explosion, they call them explosions, I think, or exclusions, whatever, where they've literally gone in and spent who knows how much money fencing in aspen to keep the elk out. It all has to do with the fact that that's the best habitat in the park for animals. And they're trying to protect it because, and now they've culled the elk and things are, kind of on that rebound. But really, really productive ecosystem as well. This is going to be kind of up there with shrublands and riparian for noise and chatter and all sorts of things going on. And again, it has to do with that dropping of litter, that nutrient recycling.
They also did that for the beaver population, because there's willow too in there.
Oh, to keep beavers out?
To keep the beavers in. And the elk out, because the elk were eating the beavers' food. So they were eating willow. So they wanted more beaver in the park. So that's also why they did that.
Yeah. No, and it's really pretty fascinating. I didn't go this last year because of all the construction, but I usually, has anybody in here not gone to the elk rut in Rocky Mountain National Park in the fall? Everybody's gone? If you haven't gone, you should go. It's fantastic. I didn't go this last year because of all the construction, but it was amazing to see the difference, not this past year, but the year before, after they had that selective hunt for the elk. Made a huge difference on the elk rut. And I talked to people that have been there for a long time. They said it's really much better in the sense it's healthier for the elk population, but big difference in the elk rut. Okay. Lodgepole pine. Pinus contorta. One of the things, and I think this picture kind of shows it, one of the easiest ways to identify lodgepole pine, to me, is that it doesn't quite look green. It's a yellowish green. And if you start looking for that, like if you know that you're in lodgepole pine habitat, start looking at the trees, and if you've got other species next to it, it's not going to look as green. And that to me is the easiest way to tell from a distance, like if I'm driving. Let me ask this question, just so you know. Does everybody know the difference between a pine and a spruce and a fir? What makes a pine a pine? Meaning in the genus Pinus. It's the needles and bundles. They have to be bundled. When you pull pine needles off the tree, they're going to come in a packet. And that packet's going to be 3, 4, or 5.
And they had a little
2, 3, 5. If you have 4s, it's usually a 5-needle pine. 2, 3, 4, and 5 go together.
And there's like a little thing at the bottom
Right.
that holds them together.
Exactly, and that's called a fascicle. Fascicle. So you talk about, maybe an easier way, I was supposed to teach this, needles per bundle would be an easier way to say it. I always like to know the knowledge and then be able to bring it down, but bundle. Lodgepole pine has 2 needles per bundle. It looks yellow. And then the other interesting thing is these cones, they're typically pretty small, but when they're green like this, you're really going to be hard pressed to find open lodgepole pine cones. They don't open on the tree unless they've been there for several years. And if you see them open on the tree, they're not going to be green like that. They're going to be like a really dark charcoal, and they'll have opened up. When you're in a lodgepole pine stand, the other thing that's really unique about that habitat, or that ecosystem, is virtually every tree is the same size. Which means virtually every tree is the same age. Okay? Well, the vast majority of pines are wind dispersed, meaning their seeds that are in those cones are going to be blown out of the pine, the cone. But I just said these stay closed. So they're not going anywhere. What is going to open those cones?
Fire.
Fire. Unless, of course, you don't have what anymore, predictably? Fire. What's really interesting about this species, so I mentioned the scientific name is Pinus contorta. But lodgepole pine, straight lodge poles. It's used a lot for construction. It's got these nice straight poles. So I thought, wow, that's great. I was a botanist being witty. I'm going to name lodgepole pine Pinus contorta. And I remember telling that story to somebody. I was up in the Pacific Northwest, and they're like, no, actually, it was first described in the Pacific Northwest. And in the Pacific Northwest, it does have a contorted growth form. It has a completely different ecology in the Rocky Mountains. And in the Pacific Northwest, it is not a fire-dependent species. It does not have serotinous cones. It's a wind-dispersed species. And what's interesting is because fire has been suppressed, I mean, we really suppress fire now in Colorado for long enough that ecologists are actually seeing a greater number of lodgepole pine cones opening on the tree, reverting back to the wind-dispersed mechanism, which is awesome when you think about it. It's in its DNA. I mean, that's, it's there. But, if you've got to, you're relying on something to reproduce and you can't get it, you got to figure out another way. So what'll be really interesting, and we won't be around to see it, but it'll be interesting to see if, we could fast forward, I don't know, 1,000 years, whether or not we would go hiking in lodgepole pine and it would be not complete stands of it. They're the same size because they started from a fire. Brutally obliterated by pine beetle. Okay. All right, next is our subalpine. So sub means below, just below alpine. 9,000 feet to timberline. The top 2 tend to be codominants. Bottom 2 also codominants. Engelmann spruce, it's an Engelmann spruce unless proven otherwise. It's a much better competitor than subalpine fir. And then limber pine and bristlecone pine. So again, limber pine and bristlecone pine have the genus Pinus. They're going to have needles in bundles. Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir are going to be single needles to the branch. Same thing with Douglas fir. And then crumholes means gnarled. So it's when you get up, you've seen that if you've ever been up at Mount Evans or whatever. Right when you get up at tree line, you get these kind of trees that are all just dwarfed and blown to one side. So that's that crumholes environment. Okay. So it is a spruce unless proven otherwise. But one of the other ways to look at it, and it's going to be hard to see in this photo, both of them look like Christmas trees to me. But if you see brown cones on the top third of the tree that are visibly noticeable, you can see them from a distance, they're brown, it's spruce. You are not going to notice, unless you have like incredibly adept vision. From a distance, you're not going to notice cones on firs. They're not as numerous, and they don't go brown on the tree. Well, maybe they do, but you're not going to, I doubt it actually because of the way they fall apart. And the spruce, the cones are hanging down. On the fir, they're straight up, they're like candlesticks. Way at the top of the tree. And I have some fir cones that are dear possessions of mine. I don't let people, when I use them in class, I don't let anybody handle them. Because it's so difficult to find them and keep them intact. You don't go underneath a fir tree and find fir cones. They don't fall from the tree. The cone disintegrates on the tree. So these cone scales here will just fall apart. And what you're left with is this little thing that looks like a twig sticking straight up on the branch. You may have seen it before and just thought, I don't know what that was. That is the remnant of the spruce or the fir cone. Firs are friendly, spruces are sharp. If you go up, I always do a touch test if it's a young tree and I don't know. Now I actually have strategically placed fir trees so I can show students when I do field trips. But if I go up to a spruce and I do it with a little bit of force, I put my hand up against the tree. If it hurts, it's a spruce because it's pointed needles. They're sharp. And they do hurt. You can do this with any spruce. Spruces are a lot used in landscaping and stuff. If you know of a spruce in your neighborhood or whatever, go do it. If you know of a Doug fir, go do it because you won't feel it on a Doug fir. On a fir, same thing. If you go up to it, you won't get that sharp point. That's why firs are friendly because they have a rounded tip to their needles. I think it's a heck of a lot easier than straining my eyes and looking because I pointed it, especially as my eyes are getting a little worse. So firs are friendly. They're great trees. I love firs. I was hiking up near Cataract Lake outside of Silverthorne. This would have been 2 seasons ago with a friend of mine. And I had found these cones a few years earlier because a tree had just fallen because of the wind. And there were all of these firs that were short with cones. You would have thought like I had just like won the lottery. I was like a kid in a candy store collecting cones that day. I was like, I'm gonna have so many fir cones. And then I left them out in the car and they all disintegrated. It was fun when I at least know now where I can go back. Should we take a little bit of a break?
Yeah.
Yeah. Question. Are needle tips like leaf tips where if it has like a really pointed tip, it's
A drip tip?
yeah, like a drip tip? Do you get the same kind of indications?
I don't think so. And any of the seeds that they don't retrieve are now potentially baby limber pines. So the limber pine actually relies on the Clark's nutcracker to reproduce. It's a fantastic story. They're very much obligated to one another. Bristlecone pine, all right, maybe not as cool, but pretty darn cool in the sense that it's some of the longest living plant species on the planet. Bristlecone pine can hold a needle, a bundle of needles for 20 years on the plant. That's what allows it to have such longevity. Talked about lightning. They're up at tree lines. They get struck by lightning a lot. And bristlecone pine is unique in the sense that if it gets, most plants, most trees, if they get struck by lightning and it cracks through the water transporting vessels and the sugar transporting vessels, it'll die. Bristlecone pine can turn that part of the plant off. Just shut it down and go on its way. The tree named Methuselah in California is aged over 4,500 years old. It's an impressive tree. And probably the best place to go see it if you have it is Mount Goliath. Here in Colorado. It's an absolute, and the Botanic Gardens has done a great job at adding in a lot of interpretive stuff up there as well. It's a beautiful, beautiful plant. So those 2 trees to me are by far, excuse my language, because you're not going to use this with your kids, but they are the badasses of the state for sure. All right. Last but not least, the alpine tundra. We are now above tree line. So we're back to a treeless landscape. Superficial resemblance to the treeless plains. And oftentimes when people, when they don't know much about the tundra, they get up there, they just think it's all rock. Because it looks like it's all rock. You have to reduce your sense of scale when you get into these plants, but they're fantastic. What I love about the alpine tundra is when you get up there in the wildflower bloom season, so usually kind of 3rd, 4th week of July, if it's a plant that has a low elevation counterpart, the flowers up in the alpine tundra look gigantic by comparison because the flower is the same size as what you get at lower elevation, but the rest of the plant body is smaller. So it just looks bigger by perspective, even though the flower itself is the same dimension. And greater than 90% of the plant's body is underground roots. I mean, you're talking about, you have to survive in a growing season that oftentimes is less than 2 months a year. All but 2 species up in the alpine tundra are perennial. They live here from year to year to year. And I love those little fat beer belly guys, yellow-bellied marmots. They're just so fun. Sitting there with their big Buddha gut, hanging out on the rocks. The only bird that lives in the alpine tundra year-round is the ptarmigan. I think it should be our state bird. Does anybody know what our state bird is?
Lark bunting.
Does anybody know why the lark bunting was chosen as our state bird? I actually learned this when I was giving a talk to volunteers here at Audubon. I always thought it was a disgrace that we have a neotropical migrant bird as our state bird. It's not even here year-round. And somebody in the crowd said the reason why, and I think this is, she was credible, the reason why the lark bunting is our state bird is because it's black and white, and if they had to print the bird on letterhead, they didn't have to use color ink. So really it just comes down to budget. And I'm thinking, but if the ptarmigan and its snow white plumage was used as a state bird, all you would have to do is do the black eye and save even more ink. But I didn't get to make those rules. All right. So I think you guys all know these, right? We already talked about the state tree is the what? Blue spruce. What's the state flower?
Columbine.
State grass?
Brahma.
Blue Brahma. State mammal, was talked about earlier.
Bighorn.
Bighorn sheep. State bird, we just said.
Lark bunting.
In our newest edition, the state reptile, which we've only had, what? Painted turtle. What do you remember, do you know the year that it was done? It's a group of 8th graders, right, that petitioned the state for, oh, it was 4th graders, petitioned the state to do a state reptile.
Yeah, I don't remember that. That's the last thing.
Yeah, it's been recent. We also have a state dinosaur. Stegosaurus. We have any other state stuff?
Yeah.
So we have state butterfly, yeah, all that stuff. Anyways. Do we? What are they?
The rock is marble, the gemstone's aquamarine, and the minerals are rhodochrosite. Sorry, I'm your geology person.
I apologize.
It's okay.
Okay, so the other ones I think I'm not going to cover so that you guys can do your stuff, but again, they're just little factoids that I brought in so you've got them. Just to kind of, again, relate the ecological importance of the area with the number of birds and butterflies and all that stuff. Okay, so that's my spiel for the evening. Thanks for putting up with me.
Thank you.